The air in the Vanguard's reception hall turned to liquid nitrogen. Archon Celine's fingers, slender and tipped with what looked like polished obsidian, caught the edge of her shimmering visor. As she slid the faceplate back, a rhythmic hum vibrated through the floorboards. Her face was not flesh, but a shifting map of liquid starlight, glowing with the soft light of a dying moon that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. A dozen human peacekeepers, men trained for every terror the stars could throw at them, watched their rifles slip from nerveless fingers to clatter against the deck in a stunned, collective silence. What did it mean for a goddess to be a target? If you want to see how this cosmic gamble plays out, subscribe and join us as we chronicle the moment two worlds finally collided. Now, let's look back at how we reached this precipice. 12 hours earlier, the only thing glowing on the Vanguard was the amber warning light of a faulty coffee machine. Captain Vance stared at the sludge in his cup, his reflection in the viewport looking every bit as tired as the decades of border skirmishes he had commanded. He was a man of iron and ink, his military history etched into the weary lines around his eyes. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this peace summit at the crystalline nebula was a beautifully painted trap. The Valerians were ghosts to him, elegant, lethal enigmas who had spent a century turning human outposts into scrap metal. The modulated translator device sat on the table between them, a small silver disc that felt heavier than a grenade. It was a cold piece of technology, designed to strip the soul out of a voice and replace it with sterile mathematical accuracy. Vance picked it up, turning the metal over in his palm. It was the only thing that would allow him to speak to Archon Celine without the risk of a linguistic mishap starting a third galactic war. He prided himself on logic until a Valerian Archon walked through his door and set his common sense on fire. The Eclipse, the Valerian flagship, was a jagged needle of obsidian drifting alongside the bulky, scarred hull of the Vanguard. It was a study in symmetry and conflict, two predators circling a kill, though today the kill was supposed to be the animosity between them. Vance watched from the observation deck as the Valerian shuttle detached. He felt the familiar itch in his scarred shoulder, a phantom pain from a railgun slug he'd taken over a moon that no longer existed. He wondered if Celine felt the same. Did she have scars beneath that ceremonial armor? Or was she as untouchable as the propaganda suggested? The Archon didn't follow the protocol. Instead of heading to the designated diplomatic suite, the sensors flagged a breach in the crew quarters. Celine had bypassed the high-tier security grid, as if it were a beaded curtain. Vance found her in his private study, standing before a shelf of old Earth paper books. She didn't turn when he entered, but the translator on her belt hissed with a static-filled greeting. "You keep the thoughts of dead men in cages," she said. Her voice filtered through the silver disc into a flat, melodic drone. Vance leaned against the bulkhead, his heart hammering a rhythm his training couldn't suppress. "We call it history, Archon. It keeps us from repeating the same mistakes." She turned then, her armor reflecting the dim red lights of the cabin. "Our mistakes are the only things we truly own. Your species is loud, Vance. You broadcast your fear across every frequency." Exhausting, the silence in the study grew thick, a physical weight that pressed against Vance's chest as he watched the Archon's armored silhouette. She seemed to be absorbing the very atmosphere of his room, her movements fluid and devoid of the mechanical jerkiness he'd expected. He didn't know if she was a threat or a miracle. Then the deck plate shivered. A klaxon tore through the tension, the rhythmic scream of a total hull breach alert. Vance's combat instincts slammed into place before the first echo died. On the tactical display, a swarm of unidentified signatures, cloaked, jagged, and hungry, burst from the nebula's gas clouds. They weren't Valerian. They weren't human. They were the scavengers of the deep void, and they had timed their strike for the exact moment the two greatest powers in the sector were at their most vulnerable. "They want the treaty to die in the cradle," Vance growled, reaching for his command headset. Celine didn't hesitate. Her hand clamped over his wrist, and for a second, The translator disc on her belt emitted a high-pitched whine as it struggled to process the sudden surge in her bio-readings. My ship is blind to their frequency, Captain, but yours sees the heat. Vance understood. The symmetry in their conflict had always been their undoing. The Valerians fought with light and logic, while humans fought with fire and grit. To survive this, they had to stop fighting as two and start acting as one. The sprint to the bridge was a blur of flashing emergency lights and the smell of ozone. Vance barked orders, his voice raw as he coordinated the Vanguard's massive railguns with the Eclipse's precision beam arrays. It was a high-risk flanking maneuver, a dance of metal and light that required total synchronization between two ships that had spent a century trying to kill each other. There was no time for doubt. In the heat of the bridge, with the Boyd outside, screaming with plasma fire, Vance and Celine stood shoulder to shoulder at the central console. Her starlight-flecked hands moved over the human glass interfaces, while his scarred fingers adjusted the Valerian targeting vectors. And then, the bridge of the Vanguard went quiet as they reached the moment of the drop. Back in the reception hall, the air had been frozen, the human soldiers' weapons hitting the floor as Celine revealed her true form. Now, on the bridge, that same starlight glow illuminated the tactical map. The bridge crew stared, but no one moved to stop her. One of the sensor officers whispered a prayer, but it wasn't out of fear, it was awe. Vance looked at the Archon. The visor was up, her face a nebula of swirling brilliance, her eyes 2 points of infinite gravity. Now, she whispered. The translator barely catching the word, they fired the final volley together. A combined lance of human kinetic energy and Valerian hard light tore through the heart of the aggressor flagship, turning the cloaked predator into a blooming flower of debris. The shockwave rattled the Vanguard, but the ship held. The silence that followed was different than the one in the study. It was the silence of a bridge that had just witnessed a miracle. Years later, that same silver translator sat on a wooden table in a house built of white stone and living vines. It no longer hissed with static. Instead, it sat silent, its job of bridging the cold linguistic gap finally finished. Vance sat on the porch of their frontier home, the smell of Valerian night blooms mixing with the scent of damp earth. He watched two figures running through the tall grass under the glow of twin moons. They were small, their skin shimmering with a faint, iridescent light, their laughter a perfect blend of two different worlds. He didn't need a device to understand them. The permanent end of the galactic schism wasn't found in a signed document, but in the way the children didn't even know what the word enemy meant. The treaty began with a spark, but it ended with a home. If you think the most powerful connections are the ones we never expected, tell us about a time you found common ground in the comments. We'll be back tomorrow with another chronicle from the stars.